Welcome to Next Steps to Leadership with your host, Dr. Stephen Oliver. In each episode, we invite experts to share their passion and their leadership journey to help you in your next steps. You can find this show on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, hrcvision.com. Now here's the host of Next Steps to Leadership, Dr. Stephen Oliver.
Hello, and welcome to my podcast, Taking the Next Step to Leadership. My name is Dr. Stephen Oliver, or known as Dr. O. So welcome to the podcast. Purpose of this podcast is to help newer and younger leaders and also mid-level leaders to learn a little bit about some tips, techniques on leadership to help them take the next step in their career. I invite a series of executives, learning leaders, human resource management leaders, nursing leaders, business owners, consultants to come in and just talk a little bit about a topic and tell us about their success in leadership and to impart some tips and techniques to the new managers. Today's topic is the intersection between mindfulness and emotional intelligence. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce my guest today. This is Dr. Matthew Lippincott. Dr. Lippincott has held corporate leadership roles in global software and healthcare industries. He's also funded and owned and led his own businesses. He consults with several organizations as a certified emotional intelligence leader and team performance coach, also a coach trainer. Some of the companies he works with are Amazon Web Services, Epic Leadership, Google, Bank of America, MIT, and many others. Dr. Lippincott holds a doctorate of education from the University of Pennsylvania in conjunction with the Graduate School of Education and the Wharton School of Business. This degree is about adult learning and the business of learning and leadership in organizations. So welcome, Dr. Lippincott. Really glad to have you today.
Thank you, Dr. Oliver. Thank you for inviting me. It's always good to talk with you.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you're up to these days, Matt? As your bio said, you're doing a lot, but what are you up to these days? That's kind of a general.
Well, thanks for your generosity and time reading all that information. What I've been doing since 2016 is working with Dr. Daniel Goleman, specifically developing and testing out work with paying clients from around the world, really looking to refine this intersection of what we call applied emotional intelligence. So we work with helping people very quickly, both as individuals and as teams, identify, measure, and increase their levels of emotional intelligence in specific areas that are empirically linked to improved performance. And as you know, there's also an relationship to the application of mindfulness in some of that work, but there's also a fair amount of overlap when you start to look at that, let's say, accepted academic definitions of mindfulness and emotional intelligence.
That's fascinating, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the tools and measurement for those topics so people can kind of gauge where they are. I wanted to know if you wouldn't mind just giving a really brief overview of what is mindfulness and what is emotional intelligence. I think that would help for those who don't know what they are.
Sure. And as I mentioned, there's some overlap between the two, and in my definitions, I'll explain how those take place. For both of those topics, one of the things I found, being a peer-reviewed, published researcher in both of those areas, as well as leadership performance, I found that there's not uniform agreement on the definitions. Mm-hmm. So let's look at what are understandable definitions. Mindfulness is really your ability to observe where your attention is. Non-judgmentally is the key. So what are you focusing on? What are you experiencing? Are they thoughts? Are they feelings? Are they associations that are positive or negative? What's your state? And emotional intelligence, particularly the competence of self-awareness, adds to that. And it helps you to understand what some of those data points are that you're picking up. But true mindfulness is really about that observation of what are you focused on? What are you experiencing? Then when you start to get into understanding why that might be, how that might be impacting your relationships with other people, the quality of your current state, that takes you out of the technical definition of mindfulness, and it gets you into things like emotional self-awareness or other things you can do with that information. So the power of having that level of awareness is it gives each of us some agency over how we're going to conduct ourselves day by day. How are we going to interact with people in such a way that they want to help us succeed? They understand our intentions, they understand the nature of our communication more effectively, and ultimately that takes people to a place where they are able to be more effective in their relationships with other people.
Well, that's a great overview and great definition of both those terms. I do agree with you. It depends on who the researcher is or who is discussing it. They may deviate a little bit from those definitions, and it's a growing science. One thing is both of these topics are not new; they've been around for quite a while. And the thing that's really exciting for me is they both are growing, and more people in business and even in other areas are utilizing them. So can you tell us a little bit, Matt, about exactly what do you do with this? What are the things that you do with this, especially with some of your clients, Amazon, in the application of helping individuals in organizations?
Sure. So there are a variety of things that we can do with people, and I'm going to break them into two sections. One is the work with the individual, and the other is work with teams.
Okay.
And typically we hear things like mindfulness and emotional intelligence. They've been very individual focused. And largely, I think that's due to Western society is very focused on the performance of individuals. We tend to celebrate and fixate on a star athlete or a famous CEO, or right, what is the individual doing, uh, ultimately to try and encourage other people to perform to that level. So when we look at the state that they're in, one of the main things that we have found, and it's backed up by vast amounts of research, as you said, and that body of research continues to grow, is that if a person can start to understand some of the simple things that are happening internally to them, they are able to greatly impact the quality of their performance. And one of the main reasons for that is because we know the vast majority of communication is nonverbal.
Hmm.
So one of the main things that I found in my research, and it's in a lot of other research, and I constantly cross paths with people dealing with these things in my work, they're struggling with expressing their intentions and their thoughts, and even things like the empathy they feel towards their coworkers in an effective way, in that everybody else understands what it was they thought they were communicating. And so helping them to see that they can monitor simple things within their internal state, like the role stress is playing, if they're feeling frustrated, or they're coming across as frustrated, but they don't realize they're frustrated. If they're coming across as angry, they don't realize that. It gives them some data points they can start to work with. So let's move over to how that's applicable in a group setting, because as you and I have discussed in the past, team emotional intelligence is measured differently. The entity of the team can have what are called norms mentioned. They can be measured. They're this kind of the equivalent of an individual emotional intelligence competency. But again, inside the team, there's this beautiful opportunity to create real-time feedback that helps each individual be more effective in the quality of their communication.
Hmm.
And so those are actually examples of applied mindfulness. If you have some external cues that say, I don't want to help you right now, you're coming across as angry or hostile, and you didn't realize that, It helps you start to use your mindfulness toolkit, but also some of your other components or theories of emotional intelligence to change the way you're interacting with other people.
And any specific tips on how to get someone who might be going off track back on track? I mean, this is great, but what might be some real specific things they can do when they are triggered? And by the way, triggers is something that's big in the emotional intelligence study. People, places, and things that trigger you: traffic, being in line at the grocery store, that wonderful employee who likes to poke at you, or your favorite sibling triggers you. So as you're just saying, if they're not their best, what might be some steps to get them back on track?
So there actually are some kind of remarkably easy strategies for this to be done. I'm not I'm not recommending that everybody go out and try and figure out how to do this independently, but they can do some research and observe and implement some of the patterns. But the simplicity lies in the fact that you can start having conversations with people about this other expanded aspect of feedback. It's really amazing to me. I think this in all of last year and all of this year, all of the team EI work I've done during the debrief periods where we look at their initial assessments, people in those teams will say, oh, well, that's because we didn't ever discuss this. That's because we didn't talk about how we are going to communicate with one another when there's this problem, or if one person feels shut down, or if one person feels triggered. So very often there are a series of easy wins where people can start to, again, in a safe, psychologically safe, diplomatic way, when everyone is calm, say, next time this happens, what can we do? Or what are some things we can do in advance to make sure there's kind of a safe dialogue that everybody's agreed to? So I'll give you an example. If a person is coming across in a hostile way to anyone else on the team or a client, I see examples like that too. Other people on the team can know in advance how they're going to signal that individual so that they know, okay, it's time. I don't see myself doing this. I haven't learned to regulate it yet, but there are people around me who are forgiving of me. They're going to help me do this. And those are things, again, I didn't come up with this on my own. I've encountered people doing field research who had figured out how to do that. We work with the people who created the team EI instrument, which is about 30 years of field empirical depth testing with a lot of corporate clients. Those are things that some people have figured out how to do over time, and it's proven to be empirically linked to very highly performing teams. So a team, or let's say you're just an individual who wants to work on this, you enlist some of the people around you to start to give you that feedback and agree how and when they're going to give you that. The starting point for these conversations have to be in a space of safety. So it's okay to say, I didn't realize I was doing this. I had no idea it was having this negative impact on my relationships, where it was having this kind of creating this level of frustration with the people who report to me because they didn't understand what I thought I had communicated effectively. Once you can create the process where your environment helps recondition you, that's where you start to see a lot of progress being made.
And from what I've learned about emotional intelligence, it's an ongoing thing, and we are continuously learning in our lives. Unlike our IQ, which is pretty much set at a younger age, we're continuing to learn it and work on it. I know myself, one of my triggers is traffic, so I try not to drive as much, and I do really well in my day, and I'm very emotionally aware, but then someone can cut me off, and then that can set me into it. So it's something that we continually need to work on. I wanted to see if you could just briefly touch a little bit about some of the tools. If, say, an individual wanted to look into emotional intelligence, taking an EQ test can be a good idea. What are some of the tools that you use or suggest, or even how to go about doing it?
Right. Well, there are a number of instruments out there, and I'll mention the one we use is called the ESCI, and It's a 360 based tool. There are a number of them that are out there. I would really encourage people to use something that is a true 360 based assessment. So not just based on their self assessment, because that can be, like you said, if you had a bad traffic experience a half an hour before you took your self assessment, that could
Right.
really off what your starting point is, that you, in terms of what you want to measure. But in terms of what's considered to be valid, having data points from third parties who are observing you in these specific areas, you want to work with that type of instrument that has been extensively statistically validated from an academic standpoint, because that means the question set has been tested and refined for all kinds of different environments and language groups, and all the variables that could throw off an assessment like that. If you can't get access to something like that, there's an approach that Dr. Goleman uses, which I always like to quote. He says, "Well, you could ask." So you could go through a structured process where you pick a number of people around you and you ask them the same question. And you keep track of the answers, and you phrase that in the context of, I want to improve. Here's my commitment to my improvement process, and I need your feedback. Give me this first round of feedback. I'll demonstrate to you that I'm trying to integrate it, and then we'll build on that over time. So everybody has access to utilizing an approach like this.
And there are some free online tools that are smaller. I use for my class, it's very simplistic, the EI 2.0 from Bradbury and Greaves under Talent Smart. And it's a short assessment, and it just opens the door. Like you're saying, I ask people to be calm, get home, calm down, take it. Try not to interpret and challenge the questions. Just take it, be your whole self. If there is a score that you're not really happy with, I always say use this as an opportunity for growth. Don't be frustrated with it. Try to work on it, and not be frustrated.
So let me build on that, because the words you used, I think, are very significant there. You want to find those scores that aren't very good. That's what we call the self-other perception gap. And what's beautiful about that is it gives you a short list of priorities where now all of a sudden where you're being ineffective with other people. And it's not to say anybody is right or wrong. It's just the basics of human nature. I've seen this, for example, on a client organization where born and raised Americans from a Northeast city are not communicating effectively with Americans born and raised in Houston or San Diego. So these are just simplistic aspects of mostly nonverbal communication that tend to throw off the effectiveness of a relationship. And so when you get that short list, that's the starting point for your custom development process. And let's circle back to mindfulness, a great time to practice. How are you going to react to this? What state are you going to be in when you talk to people and get their feedback, so that non-verbally and verbally you're conveying a commitment to really learning to understand from them what their feedback means, because they're telling you what you can do differently to enable them to help you be more successful. It's a really powerful relationship you can create. And what are some things you can do? What's a mental state you can hold to create psychological safety during that dialogue?
And that's really profound, because I think communication, snafus and mishaps are at the heart of so many challenges in business today and in personal relationships. And both these tools, mindfulness and emotional intelligence, can help in that. I'm wondering, Matt, if you could tell us a little bit about working with Dr. Daniel Goleman. To me, he's the grandfather of emotional intelligence. He came along, from what I understand, and you can tell us more, in the mid-90s. He wrote a seminal book, Emotional Intelligence, Why It Can Be More Powerful Than EQ over IQ. It's still in the top 10 best business books out there. Actually, two of my students just quoted him in their final senior paper using that book. Um, but tell us a little bit about him, and then what are some of the things you're actually doing with him in his organization and your organization?
Well, absolutely. And he's an extremely good person to work with. I point out that everything you just said, those accolades and credentials, those aren't things that have gone to his head. He's very very attentive to people when he's working with them. I'd say he really embodies the core teaching that he's tried to convey to people. And his interest is really in seeing as many people as possible learn how to work with these concepts. So the popularity of his book, for example, and you probably recall this from your academic studies as well, he simplified things that were kind of prohibitively complex to most of the people in the world. And so what we're doing today is we're trying to further simplify those things. And a lot of what I mentioned earlier around using frameworks and very simplistic step-by-step strategies to help people implement the theories without them having to fully understand it, without them having to go through any kind of a real education process, is the next generation of what's happening. So if you look at the results of an assessment, for example, we found there isn't, first of all, the ability for the vast majority of people to afford that type of support. So you typically would be done by coaching. And as you know, coaching can be quite expensive on an hourly basis. What we're doing is developing ways where people can get that information, maybe even just a little bit at a time. As I said earlier, if you had 3 or 4 things that could be your priority areas to work on, let's start with the highest one. And here are some simple steps you can follow. You can implement them by yourself, by enlisting the help of people in your environment. And from there, you can develop or increase your strength in that area. When you've completed that process, you repeat the process and you focus on, if you're an individual, another emotional intelligence competency; if you're a team, another team norm. Mm-hmm. And we've been working with that extensively. We have been testing with a vast number of paid pilots at organizations all around the world for years now, and have refined it down, especially in our work with AWS and Amazon, to some really exciting deliverables that are able to achieve consistently what I just described.
Right, that's fantastic. Really, really great. And if we could kind of circle back, because you did at the beginning tell a little bit about your work with Amazon. What is your approach to going into Amazon and or another client and saying, okay, I've got these tools and I'd like to work with your team. What's your approach and what are some of the outcomes for that team? And again, you talked a little bit about that earlier.
Well, the approach is, a lot of it I learned in software work years ago, and then in being in different roles, raising capital for business, being an owner of a business. And there's a reality there that you have to accept and become comfortable working with, which is that each customer has unique needs, each team has unique needs, each individual has unique needs. So having a repeatable process that helps you quickly identify those and then work with them to do what I call co-creation of the strategy that you'll deliver, that's really proven to be the best approach. So work with a company like Amazon continued to use that approach, spent a lot of time understanding what the key stakeholders really cared about, so that when we implemented something, it had been designed with their involvement. It was something they understood. It was something they were fully engaged with. They were committed to following through on it, which is also very important. And in their case, they had priorities around things like minimizing the amount of time that employees had to spend on this. They really agreed with us on one of the key points, which is we want to take steps that are linked to neurological development. So we want to spend and have enough small activities spread out over a long enough period of time that we know empirically we are going to create new habits, which equals a significant increase in the likelihood of success, which is very different than what a lot of people have been doing up until now. And that was one of the priorities we worked with. We've done that with some other companies going back as 3 or 4 years ago as well. And ultimately, we have come up with a uniform approach that's always customizable. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the term habits. Bradbury has a brand new book out on emotional intelligence habits, listing about 20 or 30 habits, which I think are fantastic. What is the next step for emotional intelligence and mindfulness? What do you see as the next step and where these topics are headed? And I know that's a broad question.
Well, it is, however, those of us who have been spending a lot of time with AI companies and being involved with AI companies fairly closely can see where there is a lot that is happening, that's already happened. It just hasn't become available to the point that a large part of the population is aware of it. But going back to what I just said, that customization, let's say workflows and solutions, that they just align very closely with the needs of each client that you're working with. AI allows for that to happen much more quickly, and it's positioning us to be able to do that on an individualized basis. That's not to say AI replaces a coach. It's not to say AI is going to ever be able to do anything to teach empathy, for example.
Right.
But what it is a phenomenal platform for is helping people get what you and I remember from our education as scaffolding.
Right.
Think
Yes.
of how expensive scaffolding is to deliver if you're an employer or a manager, right? So that, again, scaffolding is giving a person the next level of challenge that they're ready for. And that's going to vary person by person. It's going to vary team by team. So AI is a really excellent way to make these things available to a massive amount of people, and also to make it affordable.
And is this some of the things that you're doing in your research with some of the universities you're associated with and academic boards? Are you doing some research around AI and emotional intelligence or other things?
So in terms of AI, that's all being done by private corporations that I have relationships with, and so I'm able to see their developments as they're arising, to see where the opportunities are to deliver what we're doing in a much more scalable way. The academic research I do is very much around field research methods. So working with individuals on different projects with different organizations, oftentimes just to help them understand how to implement an empirically sound emotional intelligence research process, so that at the end they have information that they understand and work with.
Okay, that's great. And maybe do you mind just a quick comment about your doctoral research and what was it and what were some of the things that you studied and encountered in that research?
Sure. I started looking at mindfulness, and as a person who I had a background of learning techniques like that through martial arts and some of my other personal experiences over the years. And I was very curious about why there was so much hype around it. And a lot of the techniques I learned from former special forces people that I ultimately trained with or trained in martial arts. So I was curious to see how some of those things were happening in this mindfulness boom that was taking place. But what I did was I went out and I recruited these organizational leaders from fairly large global organizations, and I did research on the development process they went through that they said was supported or largely influenced or created by mindfulness practice. And some of them had been doing this 20 years ago now.
Mhm.
And through the analysis of their interviews and all the data that was collected, I came to find out there was more than just some mindfulness courses they took. That was part of it, but they also described a lot of other personal and professional development activities that didn't meet the definitions of what mindfulness does. So that would feed us back to my earlier discussion about the definitions. I had to work with other frameworks to explain all the other information I collected. And that's how I got affiliated with Goleman's emotional intelligence model. I used the core, or not the core, I used the entirety of that model for a lot of the analysis that I did. And I looked at emotional intelligence competencies in addition to the mindfulness role that was described by the people I interviewed.
And you did talk a little bit about this earlier, but how might someone again go about being more mindful? Certainly, it's taking an emotional intelligence test and then understanding your strengths in a developmental area, being open to it. I mean, that's the biggest thing, is being open to it, and then being more mindful. How might they go about starting that approach and being more mindful?
Sure, there are a lot of opportunities for it, and what I believe is the fastest way for a person to understand how it works and get value out of it is to use a device you have already, or get a device that alerts you when your stress level starts to increase. And I'm working with clients who I'm advising them on doing this all the time, and they'll come back to me within a few weeks or a month and say, I had no idea these things were happening to me. And the reason you do that is because if your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, you start feeling what is stress and anxiety, which a lot of people are so accustomed to it, they don't know it's even happening. You shut down your higher reasoning abilities, right? That's when your performance starts to get impaired. And that's when the people around you start to back off, or only say what they think you want to hear, or decide, oh, they're not ready for these helpful suggestions that I could provide right now. And that's a very almost startling awakening for a lot of people, because even if they knew they had the physiological measurements of stress, they had never also looked at, oh, how's this giving me tunnel vision? How is this causing my cognitive function to close down? So understanding that when the stress response kicks in, blood flow, right?
Right.
And physiological resources go back to the part of your brain that's there for survival. And when that happens, we know without a doubt the part of your brain that does things like make the right decisions, manage effectively, maintain healthy relationships starts to get closed off. Nobody wants that. And so that's the easiest way for people to really get started working with this.
And I believe part of that's in our amygdala, which is in the brain, part of the limbic system, and it's the fight, flight, or freeze. And we all react differently to stress. And you've said twice now, which is so powerful, Matt, about the self-awareness, just truly being self-aware. And some people can do that and others can't. And I like what you said earlier about having some reminders all around you. Who can remind you of that?
Right.
That you may not be coming off as your best self.
Well, and thanks for bringing that up again, because one of the other strategies I've been working with for that, it came to me from several people I interviewed when I did my research. They didn't really blame themselves for when they got into those states. They knew that they, for example, had a really stressful job, and there were things happening. There were going to be moments when it was very difficult for them to completely regulate themselves out of a high stress response. However, they also approached the people around them by saying, I know that. Mm-hmm. So they took this huge burden off themselves as leaders, and they just said, all the people that report to me, they have no idea what kind of stress and pressure I'm under. They just know what their state is. That's okay. I'm going to be imperfect. And even a couple of individuals that they may have been, for whatever reasons, just blind to certain aspects of interpersonal communication that they were not good at. And they're still working on it, but they came up with a system, a support system on their team and in their environment where it didn't damage the productivity of anyone. And I just found that when people, they realize that they have these reactions, they realize they're doing things that are harmful to their relationships, they're not building trust, they're not creating psychological safety. We are often programmed to now fault ourselves, and then we double up, we double or triple or quadruple the negative experience, and that becomes another stressor. So a really easy solution here is to just admit that that's happening, ask people for help, ask them for feedback, and as long as they're seeing that you keep trying, and you're improving incrementally, you take this huge burden of these problems off of your day-to-day life.
And it's so powerful that you said both looking at the individual and the team. I mean, I use that old school model: forming, storming, norming, performing. I added adjourning because, teams go through those phases, but then new projects start all over and new people come and others leave. And it's really important to know where you are on your team when these emotional intelligence issues come in. So I really appreciate you talking about the differentiation between the individual and the team.
So on the topic of the team, some of the things I've learned from working with Druskin and Wolf on this, and they're really the world's experts on team emotional intelligence. As I mentioned to you before, Dr. Vanessa Druskin, who's a professor as well, she actually did field work with David McClelland.
Mm-hmm.
So she's linked back to the person who more or less wrote the books on competencies. And then she also did field work with another, I think, Harvard Yale professor who's world famous for writing the book on team norms and team performance. So there's a lot of knowledge that was passed on to her that she used then in a lot of actual field observation of teams to identify what this very small percentage of the highest performing teams in the world were doing. And that's how they developed the team norms.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that people find really surprising to hear is that if you take people if you take 100% high performers on a team, everybody on there is a magnificent individual contributor with a magnificent record of education and skill set and IQ. There is literally no data to show that's going to be even an average or above average team. What they found is that inside that environment, the team develops what's the right balance of the skill set and the strengths and weaknesses that they have that makes them really strong, because it becomes a team people want to be on, right? It becomes a team when people are not there, they still care about how the others are doing. And your point about projects change, well, those teams have onboarding frameworks. So every time a new member or two comes in, they say, these are the norms we created. Here's how we use them. So they ramp people up to fit into their culture again as well.
I think you have to constantly be aware of the changing dynamics of those teams and the workplace. I see another podcast coming up about teams. So if you're receptive, we can come up with another one. So winding down, Dr. Matt, this has been a fascinating discussion. I've got so many ideas going on, and I'm glad you're coming this summer to teach. Any final thoughts about, as our audience is thinking about stepping up, taking that next step in their career? Any final thoughts about both mindfulness and emotional intelligence? What might be some tips and techniques or things that they can do in addition to what you've already said?
Sure. I think everyone should do a little practice, spend a little time online researching the basic, let's say, framework and methodology of some of the things I talked about. So if you want to understand how to work with mindfulness, you can do some reading and get a few techniques to practice. Let's say, for example, if you have a way of knowing when you're getting stressed out, or if you, like you said, if you know when you're driving in traffic, you get stressed out, there's some really, really simple techniques you can do. The breathing technique, or focusing on a certain part of your body, like touching your fingers together. All those things do is they divert all the blood flow back to the prefrontal cortex.
Mm-hmm.
And so even if you don't have a device that's telling you when you're getting stressed, if you know there are certain situations that stress you out, you can be proactive. Because as you said, a morning with frustration in traffic can ruin the first half of your day or your whole day.
Mm-hmm.
And that harms everybody's productivity and harms everybody's relationships. When you look at the team approach, again, I would encourage people to just do some online reading to learn about what's really known about teams. I found that was not something that's really effectively conveyed to a lot of people. And what's very powerful about it is that the focus Western society has on individuals is very deceptive. It gives people a lot of things to be anxious about. It has them focusing on developing skill sets that are very valuable as they prove themselves as an individual contributor. But if they want to become a manager and demonstrate the capability to lead and engage other people, you have to self-teach yourself on this in most cases. Very few organizations have trained people adequately on this. I can tell you myself, the first times I got put in charge of teams, it was literally like, here you go. You've done great. Right? Here's some people in 9 time zones that you can manage now. Good luck. Fortunately, I had in graduate school, I actually had old textbooks about project management and things that I went back to, but that wasn't everything I needed. So the preparation for your career development kind of falls on you. I'll leave it this way. When I did my initial research, I noticed all the people I talked with described these horrendous periods in their life where they hit a plateau.
Mm-hmm.
And they went in, they invested almost exclusively their own time in coaches and mindfulness training, and they learned emotional intelligence, might have been called something different, but they learned how to lead and entrust other people. They gave up this fear of not always being the best number one individual contributor, because they realized 2 people who aren't as good as me makes my team more effective than I could ever be as an individual. And when they figured that out, right, there was they had to give up some fears and worries. And you're not going to do that without having some skill set in self-awareness, for example, and then some skill set in understanding if people understand or they confirm back to you that they even understood what you thought you said to them.
Well, those are great words of wisdoms for stepping up and taking the next step in leadership related to mindfulness and emotional intelligence. And I was just going to add that you put it in there again. To me, the bottom line is self-awareness, being self-aware as you go to the next step. Well, I can't thank you enough, Dr. Matthew Lippincott, for coming today to our podcast. A coach, a researcher, an academic, a business owner, working with Dr. Daniel Goleman in emotional intelligence for big tech companies and other organizations. It's been really great to have you, and I thank you so much for your comments and, again, your words of wisdoms today. So thank you.
Well, thanks for inviting me, and thank you for all the effort you're making to just share this information with as many people as possible. We all need to be doing that.
Great. So thank you all, viewers, for coming to my podcast, Taking the Next Step in Leadership. If you need any assistance with mindfulness or emotional intelligence, I'm happy to help, and I'm happy to connect you with Dr. Matthew Lippincott, and look forward to the next podcast. So best to all in your journey.
You've been tuning into Next Steps to Leadership with your host, Dr. Stephen Oliver. You can find this show on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, hrcvision.com. Thank you for your positive feedback, comments, questions, and for sharing the show with others.